So firstly, I want to say a big welcome to everybody and thank you for joining us this evening. It should be hopefully a fun hour or so of just talking around a number of the factors that we all should be considering really as we're running, and we want to continue running for as long as physically possible as we go on later into our life, going forwards from now really. So it's going to be really interesting to get a bit of Q&A at the end, as well as just listening to me speak to start with, and just get you guys thinking about what you're doing day in, day out, week in, week out around your training, to essentially help yourselves make the most of the training you're doing and get the most out of it when it comes to race day, whether you're focusing on 5K, whether you're focusing on marathons, ultras. I know we've got a lot of triathletes in there as well, so we're going to try and bring a bit of context to triathlon rather than just talking around running in itself. But a good place to start really would be to, firstly actually just tell you guys that I'm recording this. Okay, so I'm going to be putting this up online. It won't be up freely available online. It'll be up online as a free download. Okay, so it won't be something that's going to be public. Most of it, of you guys, is going to be straight over your heads anyway because the camera's over there. But anyone who specifically doesn't want to be on camera, if you're in the front row, I'd suggest probably swapping with someone who's a little bit further back. But if we're all good, we're all good. Cool. So a good place to start would, I suppose, be to give the awkward bio about me. For those of you, and there's loads of you got familiar faces in the room anyway who already know me, but just to quickly go over really the fact that I'm a sports rehabilitation therapist and have been for the last 10 years or so, and over the last, I suppose Kinetic Revolution started in 2010, so working within multidisciplinary sports medicine practices before that. But really, since 2010, I've really gone down the route of working specifically with endurance athletes. Particularly, obviously, with the rehab background, focusing on the injuries that us endurance athletes pick up. I know that a few of you, we've done some one-on-one stuff before. A few of you guys, we've done some regular group sessions before. And you'll know that my interest really is a combination of the injury prevention work, the technique work, and everything really that goes alongside just logging the miles. There's no two ways about it. We're going to go on and talk about this later, that you need to get the work done. There's no kind of hacks to be able to all of a sudden run faster, or hacks to being able to all of a sudden get more from your training without putting the work in. But when it comes down to it, it's the injury prevention work that makes such a difference, and the technique work that for so many runners can make such a difference. It is a special interest of mine. Really, it gets me going. So apologies if I suddenly start waffling on about all this stuff. Although largely that's what we're talking about this evening. And again, it's from very much from either end of the spectrum. So I've worked with pro athletes in the past, both within the endurance training sphere, but also professional footballers, professional rugby players, which is fairly obvious given that I was one, hockey players, etc., etc. I suppose to talk about my background beyond just what I do for a job and what I do for academically my background, to talk about the sporting side of things, is that, as you can probably tell, 6'6", 250 pounds, ex-rugby player. Not what most people think or expect perhaps when they're going to meet me for the first time after a whole load of Twitter back and forth. A lot of the time the first response is, blimey, you're a little bit bigger than I expected. And with a kind of a look on their face of, you're the guy who's going to teach me how to run? Right, okay, cool. It's from my perspective, running's been an ever-present, whether I was playing rugby or before that when I was sailing. That was my first love, in fact, dinghy sailing. So again, as a big guy trying to keep the weight off for that. Running's always been there, and it's great off the back of playing rugby to actually be able to get back into running. But I definitely say that I'm probably a lot better known, especially given the online world, a lot better known for my involvement in helping other runners achieve high levels of performance rather than necessarily go out there and start tearing up 16-minute 5Ks and what have you myself. I run to keep the excess timber off. I'm sure we can all relate to that. As I said, founded Kinetic Revolution in 2010, and earlier on this year, I've actually started back in March a Bulletproof Runners program, which Gareth is a member of. I'm sorry to pick on you, but you're probably going to get picked on a couple of times, especially as we come towards the end of the spiel. Again, it's no surprise, putting on a seminar like this, both a free seminar here in Norwich and a seminar where I'm going to be letting people on the internet take the most from this as well. There's going to be a little bit at the end where I talk about the Bulletproof Runners program, but I don't want this to be a kind of Here's the almost info, bang, pay for it. It's not that at all. I want you guys to be able to walk away with a PDF version of all the slides, which at the end has got a whole load of bonus materials in terms of particularly what I refer to as mini strength conditioning sessions that you can go out and implement, and we talk about how to implement them within your training program from today going forwards. I'm a big fan, as we'll talk about, of the little and often approach in terms of strength conditioning work. Again, if we're thinking about the more long drawn out season and how we look at our running across a year, there are times, as we'll talk about later, where it's more appropriate to spend perhaps a little bit more time in the gym and do some more, sort of more strength-based work, some compound lifts, so your squats, your deadlifts, etc., and build that underlying base strength. But for where we are, middle of the summer right now, that's not where I'm expecting any of you guys to be. Right now, I'd be far more interested in showing you some little means that you can throw in alongside your sessions. So 20 minutes after a run on a Wednesday night, for example, that you can just spend going through a few exercises in your front room, perhaps with some resistance bands, just starting to work on some stability, starting to work on activating the right muscles, start to work on some more movement pattern based strength rather than the real underlying foundational strength that you get from squats and deadlifts, etc. That stuff more so for the off season. We'll talk about that later on. So the whole premise of the evening, faster over 40. Firstly, it looks like certainly a couple of people in the room who kind of imposters, perhaps taking notes for years to come, maybe. But but it's certainly not a case of just trying to essentially hack the system. How do we become faster runners? I asked this question in front of a group, a couple of weeks ago now, a group a little bit bigger than this, and put it out there to see what would come back, and all the usual things. Start doing more hill sessions, more speed sessions, blah, 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 blah. Getting really, really technical in terms of the sorts of sessions. People were debating whether we need to be doing, so if someone's training for a 10K, do I want to be doing lots of 800s or lots of 1200s or lots of 200s? I want to think, again, higher level than that. I want to think more big picture than that. There are no hacks. There are no shortcuts. The speed work is super important in terms of making sure that you're getting the speed work in your program at the right time to sit alongside what should be plenty of relatively easy pace running. Even 5K, where we consider 5K in the world of road running, 5K being a short distance in comparison to half marathon, ultra running, etc. But again, if we think about the world of track running, all of a sudden 5K is one of the longer distances that we're considering around that. And if you think about it in that particular frame, although we talk about 5K as being perhaps a quicker, harder, dirtier race than really making yourself hurt, is what I mean by that, than going out and running an ultra, it's still an endurance event. Okay, still your performance there is going to be predicated on your aerobic capacity, not whether you nailed a set of 800s consistently. We're going to talk about consistency. I've given the game away there, but consistently over the last few weeks. The speed work needs to very much be the cherry on top of a good quality endurance base. And even around that, even on top of that, the word I'm really getting to is the importance of consistency. As runners, the big thing that allows us to push on from month to month, year to year, and see that incremental improvement in performance, ultimately running faster, is just getting out there week after week after week after week after week and getting the job done. Are we all kind of on the same page there? Simple, but so important, and something that so many of us, myself massively included, fall foul of, and manage to sometimes let life get in the way, or in most cases, we're talking about today, let injury get in the way. And as I go on to say in the next slide here, we start to talk about in this slide, this is a pattern that so many of you guys will be familiar with. How many of you, if we do a little show of hands, have picked up something injury-wise that has stopped you running, let's say for more than 7 days over the last 12 months? Yeah? Okay, just look around for a minute. That's really, really kind of scary. Yeah, a few hands down already, but yeah, that's really scary. So from an injury rates point of view, depending on what research you want to look at. Some research talks about injury rates amongst runners being up to 80% of runners within a 12-month period suffering from an injury. And that's crazy. If you think about all the different sports that we get involved in, all the different sports that there are to get involved in, I'd argue that running is quite clearly one of the highest in terms of the injury rates. And from that show of hands there, we can all attest to that. And it's the usual overuse injuries that we all pick up as well. If you just rolled your ankle off a curb, okay, and you've gone and picked up a lateral ankle sprain, which is just kind of bad luck, then that's one of those traumatic injuries which doesn't really fit the same curve. But the majority of injuries we see, so working ground upwards if you like, you're kind of just picking a few big players, your plantar fasciitis, Achilles tendinopathy, medial tibial stress syndrome, so shin splints, patellofemoral pain, ITB syndrome, piriformis syndrome, high hamstring tendinopathy, then going up and up and up, we can talk about low back pain, etc., etc. A lot of these injuries, basically everything I've just described there, could be characterised as an overuse injury. What are we talking about when thinking about overuse injuries? Well, really, it's if we think about the nature of running as well and the way in which running starts to lead to a lot of these overuse injuries for a lot of us, it's the fact that there's some sort of biomechanical dysfunction or a weakness somewhere, a movement pattern dysfunction, which we then go and stick a whole load of mileage into with a very repetitive pattern. So running is a very cyclical, very repetitive pattern. Then all of a sudden we're going to start to notice that if the weak link, whatever it is, means that the excess stress and strain is placed upon, for example, the patellofemoral joint, so the knee, the front of the knee there, then all of a sudden, as we start to perhaps step up our training, so we've got a place for London, brilliant, just found out. Training starts to step up and we start getting really serious about it, perhaps just after Christmas. And we get this step up in volume, frequency, and and/or intensity. All of a sudden, what you were getting away with previously, just going out and running your standard kind of running week, just ticking over, or perhaps just doing some 10Ks locally or some 5K, some park runs on a regular basis, what you have been getting away with, weak links notwithstanding, all of a sudden, as we start to ramp up these factors, you start to get into a point where, I can actually feel now that my knee's starting to give me a bit of a problem because, again, we're starting to really ramp up the amount of load being put through the system, not just from step to step, but in terms of training load across the week. So that slight niggle or kind of ache or pain appears. You ask yourself that question, can I run through this? How's this going to work out? A lot of the time that's a really kind of open-ended question, and sometimes we kind of lie to ourselves and think, it'll be fine. Does that sound familiar? And all of a sudden we start throwing a few more miles at it, and the program's very clearly, so perhaps we've got this 12-week program we're working to, the program's very clearly laid out in front of us. And we think, well, knee hurts, but I get a rest day in 6 days' time. I'm sure it'll be fine. So we push on through, find that running does make it worse, and perhaps it's then, if we then add a little bit of intensity to it, so I'm going to club track session on a Wednesday perhaps, that might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We have to rest it. Again, physio, frustration, we get the exercises that we're meant to be doing, etc. We very diligently work through that, but perhaps, again, as we see in so many frustrating cases, I'm painting a really dark picture here, I'm sorry. But again, a lot of you guys can be familiar with this. We return to running perhaps that little bit too soon, or more likely, it's the too much too soon. So we get given the green light from the physio, which is all good. And again, all of a sudden, if we're not on the appropriate return to run program, and we ramp things up perhaps a little bit too fast, again, looking at that 12-week program, London's not changing. Okay, London's not waiting for you. Okay, fine. Play catch up. Right, we need to increase the mileage on this one to get back onto something like what would be the same ramp up that I'm on at the moment. So too much too soon. All of a sudden, potentially, so frustratingly, and I see it far too commonly, that recurrence of injury, which brings us back to the start of our really kind of evil cycle. Does that sound familiar? A little bit of a treadmill that, unfortunately, a fair few of us have been on. We're going to talk a little bit around this one as we go forwards in particular, the big question of here to here, so slight ache or niggle appears, can I run through this? Starting to give yourselves, hopefully, off the back of what we're going to talk about, a little bit of a set of parameters to start looking at these through and say, well, okay, this feels like this, but perhaps that's just one of those aches and pains. It's kind of par for the course. It'll be okay, versus an injury that you should really, or the early signs of an injury that we should really start to be listening to. We're going to get into that as we go forwards. But that familiar picture really leads us to the headline here. So thinking back to what I was saying a couple of slides ago, that injury just kills consistent training. Consistency is where it's at. I'm not going to stand here and say, rattle off track sessions that, they're the gold dust that you all guys need to be heading out and doing for the next few weeks, and all of a sudden you'll all be PBing in 6 weeks' time. It's kind of not about that. It's not like that. We did some sessions on a regular basis out in Chapelfield Gardens. Those sessions are hard going and effective, and again it comes down to building some of the strength with those Oregon circuit sessions and varying up movement patterns, the sort of things that we're going to be talking about going forwards. But ultimately, it's the consistency of getting out there week after week that matters, and it's the injuries that we pick up. And aches and pains, don't get me wrong, are par for the course, definitely. If you're any kind of serious runner and you're out week after week after week putting the work in, you're going to know about those little aches and pains that come with that. But knowing the difference between what is something to be really concerned about versus something to back off, and then knowing how to manage particularly the latter, can make the difference between getting a 1 week crimp in your consistency versus getting a 6 to 8 week layoff, longer than that potentially layoff if it's really serious / badly managed, which can, how many of us have felt that 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back in our training? Seriously frustrating. So, as I said, injury rates in runners, sky high, around about 80%. The question of increasing with age, what's the consensus in the room? Think back to where you're 21, think forwards to where we are now. In terms of injuries, it's really, some will potentially say, I feel like I can feel that the years are creeping up and the injuries are coming with them, but then at the same time, am I doing more running now? And others will say, you know what, I feel like I'm managing things pretty well. And that's kind of what the research says. When actually asking the question around do injury rates increase with age, it's a kind of a mixed bag. And I think what you end up with there, this is actually a conclusion some authors came to in the conclusion of one of these pieces of research, that you get into this kind of well-runner type situation where, particularly as you look through the running population of those who aren't, we're not talking 40 plus here, we're not necessarily talking 50 plus here, but 60 plus, 70 plus, 80 plus, those runners, they're largely still in the game, if you like, because they're able to manage their bodies, or they've learned to manage their bodies. So the injury rate that they would report would be less so. Those who have been getting regularly broken, so perhaps they tried to get into running in their 50s, and they found that perhaps, and rightly or wrongly, they came to the conclusion, perhaps they just didn't learn to manage the load properly, or they were badly informed, but they came to the conclusion that running wasn't for me, because I need to look at a little bit of running in the week and all of a sudden my knees are killing me. Those guys often, unfortunately, drop off the radar of the sport, so they wouldn't be included in that kind of data set. But from a perspective of experience, more than anything else, I certainly would say that when it comes to increasing with age, particularly from the 40 plus bracket, that said, I'm early 30s and I can definitely argue that I feel different to early 20s. But yeah, 40 plus bracket, you get into the realms where, again, one classic is guys reporting calf problems. We got any history of kind of 40 plus males with calf issues in here? Or we, yeah, okay, 1, 2, cool. That's certainly one pattern, and there are a number of different patterns. High hamstring issues in female 40 plus athletes, again, certainly something. Yeah, there we go. So there are common patterns that we start to see, and risk factors. And again, there's a good quote that kind of running is the biggest risk factor to running, to injuries in running, and it's kind of true. And we need to think about the risk factors in terms of the 2 quicker increases in volume, run-wise. The 2 quicker increases, particularly in, a nice way of putting it is kind of throwing yourself into speed work, where it's just too big of a shock to the system. So changing something. Okay, certainly a risk factor when we're talking about the training plan. Again, we're going to talk about that a little bit. Weight is definitely a risk factor. Getting back into things too quickly after a layoff, again, risk factor to recurring injury or secondary injury. But again, the important thing to think about that when it comes to all these injuries, prevention is where it's at. And again, experience talking, but also looking at some research from a couple of years ago where it was a piece where they looked at the whole existing body of research in terms of different means for injury prevention. So looking at stretching as a mode of injury prevention, looking at strengthening as a mode for injury prevention. This is across all sports, not just running. And looking at the effectiveness. And again, the kind of the outcome, the headline that people took from the meta-analysis was, stretching doesn't work. If you actually look at the articles, the research that they pulled to get this meta-analysis, you can't really jump to that conclusion. But the conclusion that the authors made, rather than journalists made from it, was that the big thing that makes a difference in terms of injury prevention is essentially mixed methods strength conditioning. Okay, so you're doing some mobility work, you're doing some strengthening work, you're doing some stability work. If you want to kind of think of it in kind of simplistic factors, that's the way to think about it. If we can kind of cover all bases, tick all boxes on a regular basis, then that will go a long way, from my experience as much as anything else, to start to keep you away from, and it's not to say prevent entirely, because there are so many moving pieces in this puzzle. This machine, if you like, but so many moving pieces that the best we can do is try and control what we can control, and trying to build ourselves to be as essentially resilient as possible as runners, as triathletes, mitigate what the desk does to us day in, day out for a lot of us, mitigate what a combination of the desk plus the bike does to us, triathletes amongst us, long distance triathletes in particular, and how that affects how our bodies essentially end up set up, if you will, to then try and run. The more we can do to mitigate that, the better. Injury management, for unfortunately when these things do creep up, it's trying to really get into a position where you're spotting a needle early. Firstly, identifying, is this just because I've had a hard week, or is this something that could turn into something? We're going to talk about that as we go on. And then from there, saying, right, I now know what I need to do. Better I back off for 7 days or so now, and perhaps, again, if I'm a triathlete, perhaps this just becomes a big bike week. I'll just back off the run a little bit, and then get back into the running over the next couple of weeks, rather than push on regardless, and all of a sudden find myself having to just bin the running for the next 6 weeks or so. And again, as we said with the previous slide, all we can do to avoid the spiral, the better. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about the typical aches and pains, okay, training-wise, and how you can start to differentiate really between what is par for the course that most of us will be familiar with versus what we should really be concerned about. And when I was doing my undergrad, one of the big kind of acronyms that kind of stuck in mind was SIN. Okay, and it was very early on in the sort of the client assessment module where we were learning about, trying to get the information out of the clients to learn about their injuries. The acronym stands for severity, irritability, and nature of the pain we're dealing with. And you can ask yourself, in as much as I'll be asking from a kind of a clinical point of view or a coaching point of view to understand what you're feeling, you can ask yourselves using that same lens what you're feeling as well. So let's say you're out midweek, 10K, just perhaps a couple of laps around, run down to Whitlingham, a couple of laps around Whitlingham and home or something like that, keeping it nice and easy, and you start to feel a bit of anterior knee pain. So front of the knee, back of the kneecap, that kind of region. You can ask yourself, on this, so if we start with severity, on this scale of 0 to 10, so if 0 is completely pain-free, not an issue, not a worry, 10 is the worst imaginable pain. Okay, so you kind of locked your arm off or something like that. On that scale, where are we going to put what you can feel right now? So if we're in a kind of a range 0 to 3, then in that first instance, I wouldn't say stop. I'd say keep an eye on it, listen to it. And if it stays in that range, then I'm pretty happy. Okay, obviously I'm not happy that you're feeling that, but I'm happy that it might just be a case of tight quads, something that you could probably stretch out over the next couple of days, not really having to miss the next run, but All these things will be telling us, it's never just, ignore it. Okay, but it's just telling us that, okay, there's something going on, but it's not something that's going to have to stop me in my tracks now and take time off running. If we're talking 3 onwards through 10, then that's something I'm going to be more concerned about. Something that ultimately, it'd be good to see somebody about. You're going to see a physio about, sports therapist about, someone like myself about. The moving factor on that as well. So initially, if it's 0 to 3 and staying 0 to 3, then again, this is annoying. This is certainly there. This is something that perhaps I need to go and smash my quads on the foam roller when I get home, see if that makes a difference when I wake up the next morning. That's one thing. But if we start 0 to 3, and all of a sudden, after a couple more miles, we're 4, 5, 6, this is actually really painful now, then that's again where we start to think that this is something it's probably not going to resolve itself. It's probably not something which is going to be easy to sort out in the next couple of days with a little bit of stretching, a little bit of foam rolling, etc. It would be good to get another opinion on, good to get someone to have a look at. Does that make sense? Simple little scale there. Very, very subjective. We've all got different pain tolerance, etc. But again, in the context of you, try and think about what 10 would be like. Try and think about what, on that scale, what you're feeling. Then the irritability side of things. So particularly ask yourself the question, not necessarily during the run, more so this is later in the day and into the next morning. How quickly is this settling down? Okay, that's the first part of it. Okay, so if you wake up the next day and actually it's settled down really quickly, that's something which, again, let's see if this pattern recurs after the next run, it's manageable. If you wake up the next day and it's the same, if anything, a little bit worse, then again, it's that little bit more grumpy. It's that little bit more something we need to work on going forward, something which most likely it'd be best to get looked at. But also the other end of that irritability is, if this is Monday we're talking about, you're out on a run on Monday and you felt this, if it feels all good on the Tuesday, and then you run on Wednesday, if first mile, bang, there it goes again, we've got this real irritable knee now, and we need to think about going to see somebody, getting it looked at, and again, perhaps getting some hands-on treatment. Perhaps if we're talking about a patellofemoral joint, perhaps taping it to offload it. There are lots of different options there to keep you moving, to keep you training, whilst we perhaps get you on a remedial exercise program, which sounds very special, but remedial exercise program to actually start to deal with the underlying problem. If we keep on pushing that, and getting to a point where it kicks in straight away during the next run, and it was a 4, but now it's a 6. That will extrapolate out in many cases in the next week or two to a point where, damn it, I shouldn't have run on it. I should have actually not gone on that run on day 3 and just gone and seen someone. But then it's too late. Retrospect's great, but it's kind of too late. Then the nature side of things. So from nature, literally, what is the nature of my pain? Is this a dull ache? Does it feel like someone's kind of got my knee and squeezing it? Is it a stabbing pain? Is it a shooting pain? A lot of the time shooting pains, particularly pains that move around, we're kind of thinking perhaps something more neural. Who's experienced kind of posterior thigh hamstring pain, that 1 minute it's there, next minute it kind of disappears a little bit, and then perhaps it's a little bit somewhere different in the hamstring, or perhaps a bit closer to your butt, and sometimes perhaps in the other legs. Ever sound familiar with anybody? Yeah, so more your kind of sciatic type of distribution there. A lot of the time in distance runners, people tell me, I've strained a hamstring. I've got this problem where I have these recurring hamstring strains. So again, we get into a little bit deeper and say, well, okay, so if it's a recurring hamstring strain, how long does it take to recover? Once you give me one example. So after the last time you strained your hamstring, or you had that posterior thigh pain, how long did it take before you didn't feel any pain anymore? Were you able to walk around the next day, kind of lightly jog the next day? A lot of the time it's, that's fine. It was, it's just during the run, I strained my hamstring and I was good to go the next day. If we think about what hamstring strains look like, I'm kind of going off on one a little bit now, but if we think about what hamstring strains look like, as we look at our sprinters, 100-meter sprinters, or we look at our wingers playing football, and all of a sudden it's like someone sniped them from the stand. And they're on the back, grabbing their hamstring, they're having had a little limping run to slow themselves down from maximal sprinting. That's what a full-on hamstring strain looks like. And they're going to be, if it's a bad hamstring strain, fairly immobile, or at least very awkwardly mobile over at least the next week or so. A lot of the time when dealing with hamstring type problems with us distance runners, we've got to remember that we don't move a lot of the time at the velocities that we need to move at to get a proper hamstring tear. So a lot of the time what we're dealing with this kind of non-specific is the wrong word, but this undiagnosed posterior thigh pain is referred pain, sometimes from your back, sometimes from things like tight piriformis, muscle in kind of deep in your butt cheek, which can have an effect on the sciatic nerve. When that guy starts to get a little bit tight, the sciatic nerve starts to get a little bit irritated. Sometimes we get that pain at the back of the thigh that doesn't behave like a hamstring strain. Where did I start on that tangent? I think that was talking about shooting pains. So is it a shooting pain or a stabbing pain, or does it feel like it's, does it feel sinister? Those shooting, stabbing feelings where typically they'll come as well with those numbers on our 0 to 10 scale where we're looking upwards of our 3. Okay, if someone's talking about this real intense patellofemoral pain, particularly perhaps when they're walking upstairs or running uphill, typically that'll feel a little bit stabby. And again, the sorts of nature of those pains which aren't dull aches, and they're more your shooty, stabby pains, they're the sorts of things which I'd be more concerned about. A dull ache, again, let's get you on the foam roller, let's get you a bit of stretching that you wouldn't perhaps otherwise spend as much time, perhaps you should, but perhaps spend as much time doing, and see if that makes a difference to the ache. But if it's more intense than that, more kind of sinister feeling like that when it comes to the nature of the pain, that's where we need to start to think about, okay, let's get in to see somebody. Now, the question of course comes, when I'm saying get in to see somebody as well, usually that goes hand in hand with take a little bit of time off running until I feel like that's resolved. And that's either until I feel internally that that's resolved, I'm good to go, kind of intuitively, or the physio is giving you the green light to get back into things. Particularly that's the case if you've been under someone's care for a few weeks and they've just said, just can it for now, focus perhaps on the bike or swim or cross training for us, those who aren't triathletes in the room. And when we get to that point where we have to take a few days off, when we can feel that we need to give our body a chance to rest, there's plenty that we can still do in the interim there. So various different means of cross-training. So for triathletes amongst us, swim, bike, plenty of different ways we can keep working on particularly the aerobic system. When we think about runners, standalone runners, plenty of options in terms of things like aqua jogging, things like elliptical cross-trainer. I personally hate the elliptical cross-trainer, not as an object, not as a means of getting other people to work out. It's just my preference. I'd rather go jump in the deep water and run in the pool. But there are plenty of things you can still do to keep yourself moving, and make sure that you take that opportunity to consider the other 95% of your body. So back in kind of rugby days, one issue I had, mainly because I've got massive feet and very high arches, so they don't deal with stress very well, particularly on hard grounds, with metatarsal stress fractures. They've become a kind of a bogey injury, if you will, for me, sort of special interest as well for me. And I very quickly got to a point of understanding that my foot's buggered, fine, need to take a bit of time off here, but there's a whole load more I can do to work on. And even something like a stress fracture, where you've got a bony injury that you really need to look after and be kind of wrapping cotton wool a little bit, in the early days in particular, there's still, if we're careful, so many different things we can work on. So you can take an opportunity, we can take an injury as an opportunity, if you want to frame it in that way, to go and work on the other areas, strengthen the other areas, come back stronger. Okay, now when you do get back into a position when you're able to come back stronger, getting onto the appropriate return to run program is really important. I can send out actually as part of an email off the back of this, the return to run program that I generally give people if they've been off for a considerable amount of time. So kind of thinking about 6 weeks, 8 weeks, where we're really starting from scratch. But what I want to think about is what actually happens when we have to just take a few days off, perhaps a week off, perhaps 10 days off. And there are a few little parameters you can start to work through, not parameters, wrong word, but as you start to work through, as we start to get back to running, having done the right thing early and listened to your body and said, right, okay, I'll back off, perhaps focus, triathletes amongst us, focus on the bike for a little bit, so that we can test our body out a little bit before we actually then get back into running itself. So I often like getting people doing a little bit of skipping. And you can go literally jumping rope. Okay, so working through 5 to 10 sets of 20 seconds. We don't have to go high volume with this at all. And this is particularly pertinent when we're talking about kind of knee downwards type injuries. Knee relevant as well. You can also imagine that you're jumping rope. Okay, I'm not, guys in particular, sometimes I've gone down this route as a less experienced rehab, a less experienced coach, of saying, right, we're going to get skipping rope out now, and spent then half an hour trying to teach somebody how to jump over a rope. You can also work on the same principle of just doing some really light plyometrics, really simply just jumping up and down, imagining you're skipping over a rope, and you can take that double leg jumping approach and tick the box. If you're okay, 5 to 10 sets of 20 seconds doing that, cool. Let's try on the affected leg. Not immediately, perhaps the next day, on the affected leg, doing the same, but hopping. Again, up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down, 20 seconds, 5 to 10 sets on that affected leg. If all good, fantastic. If we can tick those boxes, which only takes a couple of days to tick, and I know the temptation would be to do both at once, but there's no point in getting through all the jumps and then suddenly finding that the compounded loading of the jumps then sets you up pre-fatigued to do the hops, and then you fail. Okay, so you do one, then you do the other. And then from there, that's where, if you're ticking both those boxes, it's very simple, but we can get you out and just doing a little tester run. So just going out, 10 minutes, easy pace, regardless of where you are. So back to our 12-week kind of London plan. Regardless of where you are on that plan and what today really should be, if I was to jump straight back into things now, just go out, see what that 10-minute jog feels like, and again, tick the box there. Okay, again, if you don't tick the box, if it doesn't feel good, that informs you to take a little bit more time off. Or perhaps if you've done this self-guided, perhaps at that point, that's where you need to go and see a physio and get a little bit more. The taking a few days off approach hasn't worked for you. With a bit of a stretch, bit of a foam roll hasn't worked for you. That's where we need a little bit more input. If you can tick the box there, then that's where you can get back into your running, but resist the temptation. Particularly if the next run on your schedule is a long run, resist the temptation just to jump straight back in there. Or worse still, the temptation is to try and play catch up. Okay, really important. Does that make sense? Yeah? Fantastic. So, okay, faster over 40. Obviously, we need to think about the latter part of that sentence. What happens beyond 40? And it's quite depressing reading, really. And 40 is a bit of a, it's a theoretical line in the sand, isn't it? It's a title of a seminar. This really just talks about aging. Okay, and people age at different rates. And yeah, particularly the first one I find very relevant, particularly the third one I find very relevant. This is more performance-based and just talks about really, that's going to really inform how we see you performing at a park run at the weekend or your half marathon, etc. But thinking about the mechanics of it all, thinking about how the body deals with stress and strain and load, that's really important, reduce muscular strength and power. We'll come to that in a second. Tendon elasticity. Again, I'm looking for typos as we go through this. I look at words and think that's not how you spell that, but it is. Okay, we're cool. Tendon elasticity. That's something, again, when thinking about calf injuries. Calf injuries, history, who? Anybody in the room? Yeah? So, again, thinking about an injury type or an injury area that I see more and more, particularly as we go through the ages, and we see athletes in their 40s, athletes in their 50s, calf and Achilles certainly becomes, I think, more prevalent. Again, research-wise, probably a bit more sketchy than my fairly solid opinions, experience-based. But if we think about what really starts to happen, the way in which, particularly if we think about the Achilles tendon, the way we lose a bit of elasticity there, that's going to affect how the whole calf Achilles unit starts to be affected. Flexibility, again, that's something we need to really work on maintaining. And a lot of the time with these things, it's maintained, just like bone density as we go forwards. It's maintain flexibility, maintain bone density. Particularly female athletes, osteoporosis is an issue, and aging is going to be a factor on top of that. Exercise, sport, movement, loading. Bone isn't just a static, like this, structure. We think about the way in which muscles respond to training. Okay, so we can train our muscles, get stronger, increase lean mass, increase strength, all these sorts of things. but we don't think about bones in quite the same way. We should do. We definitely should do. Think about Tim Peake. Okay, so the British astronaut who's just come down from the space station. He's going to have had to have gone through a real sort of reacclimatization process to gravity, because being up in the space station, he's not had to deal with gravity, and in the time he was up there, not sure how long he was up there, but in the time he was up there, it would have certainly been long enough for him to actually lose a little bit of bone density, because his body hasn't been used to, or having to day in, day out, deal with the load-bearing side of things. None of us are in a zero-gravity environment, so it's not that extreme or that intense, that much of an issue we have to worry about. But as we start to age, as we start to get older, then we get into a position where we need to make sure that as we keep exercising and we keep particularly the load-bearing type of exercises, just like running, we're going to put ourselves in a better position than perhaps our counterparts who don't run and kind of sit on their arse all day. So these two as well, I'll come back and talk about these in a second, but these two last ones are really important. Okay, so the recovery time side of things, which we'll talk about, as we're going to talk about session planning in a little bit. But essentially the best way of putting it is, if you think about when you were 21, the margin for error you had in training was huge. And from my point of view, thinking back to 21, there was a lot more rugby than there was running, and you could just smash yourself day after day after day after day. You'd have a rest day perhaps. Yeah, there's a rest day coming up in about a month, or an easy week coming up in about a month, perhaps 6 weeks. For as we look onwards through life, the margin for error in terms of getting the work-rest balance becomes a lot slimmer, and we need to really factor in this part of getting the rest in the right places, not just the rest within a week, but the rest within a larger schedule. So think about, right, hard week, hard week, hard week. Perhaps I now need an easier week from a run perspective before then getting back into a hard week, hard week, hard week. We're going to talk about that going forwards. And how as well, from a triathlete's point of view, it doesn't just mean total training load decreases. It could be run week, run week, run week, and then just focus a bit more on the bike. And then run week, run week, run week, then focus a bit more on the bike, or swim for that matter. But like I said, we'll talk about that going on. Interesting comments around the reduced muscular strength and power. I found a really interesting article, a really interesting piece of research in researching this, putting this together, where they were talking about biomechanical changes, so running gait changes in essentially an aging population, and how running gait changes as we get older. And to again very briefly paraphrase, one point they made was that with reduced muscular strength and power, the older athletes displayed less vertical displacements they were running, so less ability to push themselves off powerfully and make that big bounding stride, cover the ground. We can all picture, I suppose, this picture of Mo Farah or another elite runner, picture him from a side-on view, these big, powerful, rangy strides, in comparison to perhaps what you could put in inverted commas called old man shuffle. Okay, Iron Man shuffle, old man shuffle, you know what I'm talking about. What they were saying, and they used the term old man shuffle fairly sarcastically, I suppose, but they were saying that there's a bit of logic to it, because what happens with these athletes, where they lose a degree of the muscular strength, muscular power, as age goes on, they accommodate that by increasing cadence. Because without the power, without the strength, ground covered per stride is going to be a little bit less. And therefore, the only way, so let's say if I'm trying to run 8-minute miles, just staying constant 8-minute miles, if you suddenly say to me, right, I'm just going to take a little bit of power away from you and allow you to cover, therefore, a little bit less ground with each stride, the only way I can keep running 8-minute miles is make shorter, quicker strides. Okay, so that's, again, just an interesting aside, but a lot of us can probably relate to, or picture in our mind, a race that we've been in, where we've seen this old chap or lady running along, and in our mind we're thinking, I'm working really hard here, and they're looking like they're not moving overly efficiently, but damn it, life's not fair. And that's just an interesting kind of aside in terms of the way in which, as we age and the power changes, gait changes with that. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So these are all factors that we need to work with and factors we need to do something about. So a big way of dealing with that and starting to, as we've said here, maintain strength and power, bearing in mind that if all things being equal and nature was left to its own devices, we'd start to be on a bit of a downward curve in terms of strength and power as time goes on. If we're looking to maintain strength and power, then regular strength conditioning is a great way of doing this. Who's seen, there was a great video a number of, probably months ago, of a chap, Eugene Uxter. He's a 96-year-old, I believe, world record holder for 100 meters. And did you see that, anybody? Yeah, cool. Super inspiring stuff. And I actually tracked down a couple of interviews with him and sort of fascinated by him. It was something in the region of 6 to 8 years ago, it was in his 80s, that he took up running. So I had in my mind, oh, he's this lifelong runner, super inspiring. He's been at it for years, and he's just, hats off to him, massive inspiration. That just was elevated even higher when I realised that he hadn't been doing this for very long. Now, why I bring him up is he talks about a term that he uses, just calls it muscle training. And when he started running, he realised that he needed to start muscle training. And what that basically means is getting in the gym and doing some light resistance work. And that is something, if we can all be a shade of what someone like he is achieving at that kind of age, then we're all doing very well, let alone getting to that kind of age. But yeah, what we're trying to do is to, with regular strength conditioning, maintain strength and power, develop joint mobility and flexibility. And that could equally say maintain joint flexibility and mobility. Bone density we've spoken about. Again, regular strength training will help with that. And ultimately, as we spoke about with the meta-analysis, the piece of research that pooled all the research in that field, strength conditioning, mixed method strength conditioning, does help in terms of preventing running injuries. It's something that, again, from a personal point of view, an experience point of view professionally, again, I'm happy to stand beside. It makes all the difference. In season and off season, two slightly different things. Okay, so in season, and again, I was speaking about the Bulletproof program earlier on, it's very much pitched as a year-round program, so it mainly focuses on the in-season side of things, but it's little and often, and that, for me, is the biggest point to make. Little and often is a very doable, very achievable process when it comes to getting these strength conditioning workouts in, rather than trying to commit to realistically what could be and looks more like that off-season program, 3 60-minute to 90-minute sessions throughout the week alongside triathletes in the room. You're swimming, you're cycling, you're running. Again, runners within the room, that in itself is enough of a challenge, trying to commit to significant gym time alongside your run training. For me, I'm all about trying to be as pragmatic as possible, as realistic as possible. We don't all have the life of a professional athlete to start kind of shuffling around. The diary of professional athletes starts shuffling around. What really differentiates a lot of professional athletes from the majority of us is the time for recovery. Again, the time to be able to actually make the most of the sessions that we've just done. If a professional athlete is out and having just done a 10-mile run at a middle of the day on a Wednesday, and you've gone and done the same in an extended lunchtime, the difference between you and him or her is the fact that you've probably got to scurry back to your desk and wolf down some lunch out of a Tupperware box and get back to your work, whereas he or she can actually really think about getting the right food in at the right time, taking the appropriate rest, maybe I've got a massage booked in later in the day, all the appropriate steps to make the most of the training. We don't have the time to then get into the gym, etc., the majority of us, and I would be far more expectant of an athlete to be able to commit to getting into their front room after perhaps a midweek 10K and giving me 10 to 20 minutes worth of targeted mobility exercises, stability exercises, strength exercises, functional stuff that largely is bodyweight based. Some resistance band. I'm a big fan of a resistance band. I think it's very versatile, but also you can stick it in your rucksack, in your suitcase, and find yourself in a hotel room, God knows where, and still get the work done. And 4 or 5 times weekly, spread out across the week, particularly when it comes to the movement patterning type work, I think, again, makes such sense, because when we're dealing with a lot of the bodyweight exercises, so let's take a single leg squat, for example, or a single leg kind of arabesque, so where I'm standing on one leg and I'm looking to reach forward towards the wall here, really reach forward and maintain my balance and come back up and control it the whole way through. As I'm going through those kinds of exercises, that's not challenging me maximum strength-wise. That's challenging me from a control point of view and a movement point of view, and making sure the right movement's coming from the right place at the right time point of view. The body learns with that side of things, the movement side of things, far quicker with repetitive exposure. And again, this is my experience talking more than probably being able to back this up, but learns a lot quicker with repetitive exposure to a movement pattern than it does just hopping in the gym 2 or 3 times a week and doing a big, long, protracted session, where a lot of the time you kind of end up just making yourself tired for your next run. I liken it to learning a language. So if you wanted to go and learn French, one of the quickest ways to go and learn French is this kind of total immersion, just go and drop yourself into the south of France. If your lifestyle allows this, go and take 6 months out and go live in Provence. Your French will come on like that. In the same way as we're talking about total immersion, or giving you a lot of exposure in a short time, doing exercises on a very frequent basis. If we're trying to improve balance, you need to be working on your balance every day, not spending an hour every Sunday working on your balance. Does that make sense? Yeah? And again, as we said there, mostly bodyweight strength work and mobility work. Bodyweight is the key there. Resistance bands, again, I've added, they're the one kind of tool that I try and get people doing. I think the more you can do anywhere, the better. Also, this is more from a therapist's point of view, or a rehabber's point of view, a coach's point of view. If you know your anatomy well enough, if you know your biomechanics well enough, you can pretty much take an empty room, take an athlete, and get the job done. Okay, you can still make sure you can target the right areas just through starting to work different parameters, sort of speed-wise with an exercise, and I don't just mean speeding things up, but slowing things down, really working on the timing of the movement, but also the quality of the movement, and making sure that, again, the right things are working at the right time, the right movements are occurring at the right time. That changes. So that was all in season. That changes. Off season, it all gets a little bit more intensive. Now, off season means different things to different people. If you're a club runner who's pretty much got an event diary stacked through the whole year, then this might be harder to fit in. But again, room full of triathletes, a lot of the time we're thinking about what we can do in the winter to set ourselves up to be more effective in the summer, as race season kicks off. Getting people into the gym to do 45 to 60 minutes worth of slightly more, as I said there, compound-based movements. By compound, I mean moving multiple big joints at once, right? It's kind of the opposite to isolation movements. So isolation movements being like a clamshell type exercise. Getting you doing some real fundamental foundational strength work. That sort of thing is very taxing. That sort of thing is going to take it out on the legs and affect your run perhaps the next day. That's why, for me, it's off-season stuff rather than in-season stuff. But if you can find a time to start to put in a good 6 weeks to 12 weeks in the off-season of this type of base fundamental strength, then it will pay you dividends into the season as we get into the summer. That's a little bit beyond the remit of some of the stuff I wanted to talk about tonight. But again, in terms of your big movements, we're talking squats, we're talking deadlifts, things like that. Stuff which, for a lot of us, where a resistance band exercise you could pick up perhaps off YouTube, and you're not likely to do yourself any harm. Starting to put some decent weight on a bar and doing some back squats, you're probably going to want someone to give you, at least in the early stages, a bit of instruction to make sure you've got technique spot on. Otherwise, again, particularly low back is something you really want to look after. Same thing can be said for deadlifts. A word caution, but well worth it. Okay, so on top of the strength conditioning side, we need to think about how we structure our training plan. And how structuring our training plan looks a little bit different from 40 onwards. Again, 40 being a kind of an arbitrary figure, but as the years progress, let's just say, in comparison to what we were doing when we were 21. So as we get older, warm-ups, particularly, and I hear this throwaway line so often, it just takes me a little bit longer now to get into a session. It takes me a little bit longer now to warm up. Warm-ups and cool-downs, they matter that little bit more as we start to get that little bit older. I've actually linked there a little 5-minute routine where you can just go through, it's actually filmed out there on using a park bench. You've probably seen it, a few of you, where we're just going through some key areas. As I've said there, particularly hips, ankles, lower back, really put together to start to scratch the itch in terms of what we see from athletes who have just spent all day behind a desk, all day behind a wheel, hitting the areas that just perhaps before you get into the session need a little bit of greasing, if you like, add a little bit of movement there so that when you get into your running gait, it's that little bit more fluid. We're not just running up against really tight, in some cases kind of tight hip flexors are a good example. So yeah, have a look at that link. Cool downs, again, really important. I often try and get actually the strength conditioning type sessions to be done at the end of your weekly, let's say it's a midweek 10K. I'd get you out, do the run, warm up first, do the run, and then going to get you in to do the strength conditioning session. A little bit of mobility work, a few key exercises. It actually sits quite nicely along the run as being a bit of a cool down at the same time. But then the big one on this slide really is talking, well, a couple of big ones, talking about managing volume, intensity, and frequency of sessions. So perhaps, again, in years gone by, you could run 6 days a week, not an issue, not a problem. It might be worth considering, if you're starting to pick up on a few more of those kind of low-level niggles that we started talking about, might be worth considering particularly the frequency side of things. Okay, so which is naturally going to go alongside the volume side of things. But do I need to give myself perhaps a second rest day? Do I need to go 5 days a week instead of 6 days a week? That should be fairly intuitive, fairly obvious. What I think people get wrong more commonly is the combination of intensity and volume. It's where people start to stack up intense sessions next to one another. Okay, so perhaps you've got your long run on a Sunday. Perhaps you're maybe a Monday, perhaps 4-mile easy recovery run. But then you've got a group that you run with on a Tuesday, and we're going to do a bit of a tempo session. And then on Wednesday, I'm going to do some efforts with the club. Sticking these two side by side for a lot of runners wouldn't be a problem, but it's not a problem until it's a problem. For some runners, that is a recipe for starting to cause ourselves problems. What I would much rather see is us, if we're running consecutive days, trying to put, particularly from a run perspective, understanding that many of you have cycling and swimming to factor into all this as well, trying to put an easy run session next to a hard run session, next to an easy run session, then a day off, then a park run if that's a Saturday, and then a long run the next day. Okay, so we're starting to vary the intensity as we go through the week rather than just compounding the stress on the body. Because mileage isn't the only stress factor. Okay, mileage is an important stress factor coming under volume, but the other stress factor to think about is how hard you're running. Okay, biomechanically, that's going to put a lot more stress through the system the harder we run, so we need to manage that as well. So that's kind of thinking week by week. I've actually put an example, very simple example training week within the deck here, so we'll flick through that in a second and have a look. I've also put a little graph talking about weekly training load. And let's say we're progressing across our 12-week London plan. In 12 weeks, 16 weeks, depends on the athlete entirely, 18 weeks in some cases. But the way we're going to increase the run volume as we go through shouldn't just be linear. Okay, again, some people when left to their own devices, particularly kind of newer runners who perhaps haven't had the input from those a little bit who've been around the block a little bit more, those with the experience, you just reverse engineer the 26.2 miles. Think, right, I've got to run this. Well, that means back. What does that mean in terms of this week? What does that mean in terms of this week? What does that mean in terms of this week? And then that begins to look like a linear increase in the amount of work they're doing across the week. Rather than being linear, I'd rather see it as a staged increase of training load, making sure that we've got every third or fourth week, again, that's going to vary athlete by athlete, third week, fourth week, depends on essentially trial and error, giving yourself a lower run training load. Okay, so that doesn't mean lower training load across the board. From a triathlete perspective, we can start to consider that to be a week where I'm just perhaps focusing a little bit more on one of the other disciplines and letting the running just back off a touch, ready to then push on again as we go forwards. We'll look at what a graph of that looks like very quickly in a moment. 4 or 5 10 to 20 minute post-run strength conditioning sessions per week. Again, if you've got a slightly easier run week, perhaps 5 is more doable, but 4 is a good baseline. I'll try and work on the principle that whether we're dealing with kind of the prevention type strength conditioning work here, or whether we're dealing with rehab, 3 sessions a week is maintenance. That's what I try and tell people in terms of asking how often should I do this exercise, which is your classic kind of comeback when given a link to an exercise, perhaps when they're asking a question online. 3 times a week is maintenance. Anywhere onwards from there, you're going to start to see progress. And again, I'm not asking for 90 minutes 4 or 5 times a week, but just 10 to 20 minutes consistency, again, is where it's at. When we get to a taper period, we dump the strength work. Okay, so we don't worry too much about anything that's really going to start to take it out on our legs. But the mobility work, the balance work can stay. And lastly there, let's make sure that at least 1 rest day in a week. Okay, now, what I was talking about in terms of, and again, this is very, very basic, but a simple, this is kind of an example, week 6 of a half marathon training plan. So, start at this end, okay, so relatively long run, 10 miles. Off the back of that, so that should be a nice easy pace, very aerobic. Not doing any strength conditioning there, you could do, but a lot of the time, Sunday, family day, get the run done, get into your day. From here, Monday, optional cross-training day. Okay, again, that I'd rather keep as a relatively low intensity recovery cross-training session, but the important part of that Monday is your strength and conditioning, post-run, there's the error. Okay, post-run, your strength conditioning session, copy-paste. Tuesday, naturally, intervals, more intense. I haven't put intervals alongside tempo on the next day. Okay, if we're not running Monday, running Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday off, park run Saturday, long run Sunday, I'd much rather this kind of pattern, hard, easy, harder. Okay, making sure that we're starting to give the body, although we're not taking time off running per se, giving the body just a little bit of an ease up from the intensity. Again, you can play with where you put these, as long as my attitude is as long as you get the sessions in, strength conditioning wise, you're probably not going to want to stick it after an interval session. If you've worked hard enough, you're probably not going to want to stick it after a long run. Okay, maybe a bit of mobility work here. But if we can get the 4 in, that's what matters. Does that look reasonable? Does that look doable? Cool. And then alongside that, shaded area here, taper, if we're using a 12-week program, mileage up the side, just that gradual kind of wave increase in terms of the mileage. Okay, so we're looking at build, 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 back off, build, 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 back off, build, build, and then we're into our taper. Okay, that's here and here going to give your body an opportunity. It's not no running. Well, upwards of, in this athlete's case, upwards of 14 miles a week, so still getting some work done. But it's just enough just to take the stress off the body, the cumulative stress that comes from backing up potentially 12 weeks worth of work, okay, across the program. So again, different variations of this. That's very much just a kind of a visual to help tell the story, really. Okay, so I have added in here, I haven't gone down the route of saying, you need to do this session run-wise, that session run-wise, etc. Because we're all so different, with different goals, different backgrounds, all those different things. But what we have got is 3 different, what should be 10 to 15 minute sessions that you can mix up. And what I would do, if we've got 1, 2, 3 here, I would go 1, 2, 3, pick one, okay, and just see across the next 6 weeks how you feel having gone through this little pattern. Okay, just working through these. Now, the videos should be linked up, okay, and you'll be able to download those videos so that you can check out the, if it doesn't work, I'll send you another version. I've just noticed that these have got the underline, these ones haven't. But yeah, they should be linked up and you'll be able to go and check out the actual exercises, the tutorials, either on my YouTube channel or on the Kinetic Revolution website. It goes through the detailed tutorial for each one of those. And again, sets and reps, some specific details for the session listed in there. And again, I'd be really interested, just off the back of these little example sessions, to see how you guys feel, to see how you guys get on. Okay, hopefully that'll be helpful.
Should they be done straight after the run, or could they be done at a different time during the day?
Again, trying to be a realist, as long as it gets done, I'm happy. Now, I wouldn't want you to get into something like this hip flex and quad mobility exercise from cold. So perhaps after it literally could be a 5-minute brisk walk, so perhaps walking the dog or something like that, or walking down the shops and back. Basically, don't just stand up from behind a desk and jump straight into the exercise. Ideally, post-run, I think does work very well, but I'm trying to be very pragmatic about these things, and I just want to see at the end of the day that if you've got a progress sheet, just the sheet ticked off, definitely. So, that leads us quite nicely to a little bit of Q&A. And I know we've run on a little bit, but if you guys are cool just talking about this stuff, then I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. So if anyone's got any questions, now's a great time. If not, I'm at the end of an email as well. Is that useful? Yeah? Good. Cool.
So that schedule you laid out for the runners for the half marathon, how much would you take of that if someone was doing loads of biking as well?
Depends, I mean, no, absolutely not. It's very much half marathon specific. If you're doing 3 runs, 3 swim, 3 bike in a week, you can have a bit of a play as well with where you put those post-run strength and conditioning sessions, or we can call them post-exercise strength and conditioning sessions, because I have no issue with if on a Friday you've cycled and that's all you're doing on Friday, and then that means that actually that's a fairly time available day for you, and that fits, then by all means stick that in there. Yeah, does that kind of answer the
sort of
what's missing?
I guess something just a little bit more of an example. So I was kind of thinking, Wednesday, would you bother with an easy run if you're going to go out and bike? Because the easy run is probably just exercise in your heart.
Yeah, cool. I see where you're going. I thought you were talking about the S&C side, how it makes that with running. When we're thinking about some of the easy pace running, particularly in here, I always try and avoid, people kind of push back against the term junk miles a lot of the time. People, I'm very quick to say when people start talking about junk miles, and I'm one, I've made videos and articles about junk miles, the whole concept previously. If there's a purpose for the mileage, then it's not junk. And easy miles, when it comes to building the aerobic engine and getting the weekly mileage up and the time on the feet up, really important, definitely. If you're getting that aerobic workout on the bike, then I'm more than happy to, as you're saying, dump that, make sure, so if you're training for Ironman, we need the time on the feet, okay? We need to make sure we're building that time on the feet across the weeks, but we can be a little bit more specific about the run sessions that we're doing and make sure we're just focusing on the quality sessions where we know that what would otherwise be in a pure run program, where we'd need to put the easy sessions in. Perhaps we were doing 6 days a week, we'd have an easy session here as well, more of a recovery session here. That would be in there to start building that aerobic engine, building the, as we said, that aerobic capacity is very much the predicting factor in terms of performance with these endurance sports. If you're getting that on the bike, Gareth and I were talking about this before I started talking up the front here today. Training, and triathletes will know this, that training goes from bike to run, just doesn't go the other way. Okay, so I see so many athletes triathletes who've been injured, they've continued their work on the bike, and because they've continued their work on the bike, they're actually aerobically not in too bad a shape after perhaps 12 weeks off running. Problem with that sometimes is that they get into their return to run program, and because they've got the aerobic capacity there, the fitness is there, they perhaps get a little bit too excited and they kind of start doing a little bit too much too soon. Whereas for club runners, if it's been a 12-week layoff of running, the limiting factor a lot of the time when you get back into this return to run program, the limiting factor is heart and lungs as much as anything else. Okay, especially if they've not been doing any cross training or anything like that. So that limiting factor, almost as a unintentional protection mechanism, starts to look after. Perhaps it's the broken metatarsal that's healed now but needs to be looked after as you get back into running. Whereas if you've got someone who's training for long distance triathlon, they've been doing loads of work on the bike and they're aerobically very fit, it's a slightly different thing. But yeah, I'd certainly allow yourself to strip back some of those easy miles and focus on the quality sessions. Yeah? Cool. Anybody? Yes, Jonathan?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things lately about, in terms of just purely injury prevention, about the surface you run on, the fact that often trail running or difficult surfaces, if you can master that, that in itself is very good at injury prevention with the way it's making the legs move differently and stuff like that, rather than just flat roading. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Absolutely, and it's something I wanted to say and didn't, so thank you. But I see, and again, no data that I'm aware of that I can certainly bring forward anyway in terms of backing this up, but I see far fewer broken trail runners, other than tripping over a tree root or what have you.
Absolutely.
You know, I've done it as well, Richmond Park. It's embarrassing, but it's the variation of movement patterns counts for so much. I often say to club runners as well, if you can get into and through the cross-country season uninjured and have a solid cross-country season, that's going to set you up so well in terms of strength going into the road running season. It's going to make such a difference. For a lot of people, you know, getting to that point, getting through the winter, they're dealing with niggles from the summer, so it's a bit unfortunate. But if you can start creating that variation, it really does build strength in a way that, I often talk about hill running being a great way of building strength, but as soon as you start to add in those other planes of motion, it's crazy. I went on I actually ran it with a client a couple of years ago, the Ashford Kent half marathon, pitched as being a little bit of off-road with largely road, 2 laps. There was a lot more than a little bit of off-road, and the off-road was basically fields that looked like they'd been relatively newly ploughed and then a downpour. So it was kind of trudging through this mud. And I should know better, but I was perhaps fed a dose of my own medicine or a bit of a wake-up call when the next couple of days I woke up and my hips and nothing sinister, nothing bony, but my bum, because I'd just been worked out in such a different way, running across all this uneven terrain. And I like to think I do a fair amount of hip training, glute training, that sort of work, as you'd expect. But that was different. That was entirely different. So there's that, but there's also shoe rotation. Not a thing I really want to get into, but something that I do think a lot of runners would benefit from. So I'm not saying on one hand you're going to have a pair of Vibrams, on the other hand a pair of Hokas, and mix up between the two. But if you can find, I suppose more appropriately, if we're running in a pair of, if you find some Asics 2100s, that series, and some Brooks Adrenaline, so shoes which are relatively similar in terms of offering stability, and just mix it up a little bit. If you find that both those shoes work for you, I'd much rather someone have a pair of each than 2 pairs of 2100s. Okay, because it's going to give the foot a little bit of a different workout each time. And again, the same conversation can be had around different levels of drop. Looking at the differential between stack height at the heel, stack height at the forefoot. I generally get on really well somewhere around about a 4mm drop shoe. I've got some 0 drop shoes. I've got some slightly more kind of traditional, slightly more traditional running shoes. So, something more like a Brooks Glycerin. But it's just mixing it up around those. I find that it really does give a decent variety is the best word for it, really. Of course, be careful around that. Don't just go and suddenly pick something outlandish off the shelf and see how you get on. But you'll know how your body tolerates the various different stimuli you give it. Anyone else?
Where do you stand on inserts for shoes? Are you someone that
Off the shelf or?
No, actually properly.
Different things. Well, first, I work with a podiatrist down in London he's in real demand. He's a good guy at what he does. He's the first to admit that of his profession, There are those that are fantastic, just like every profession. Those that are fantastic, those that are not so much. Those that will try and give an orthotic for every single issue, and those who will be really, really, really specific about who does and who does not get something from them. It's knowing who you're going to see and trusting who you're going to see from referral, etc. But also, I would always rather... Okay, one thing before I say that. Someone asks me, do orthotics work? And the question often is, do orthotics work? Define work. Make a difference? Yes. If I stick a 50p coin in my shoe, that will make a difference to how my foot loads. Okay, so orthotics do something. If we define work as do something, then yes, they do. The problem is, we need to know that we've got someone who's got the skill level and the appreciation of the biomechanics and the stress and strain of the tissue that we're trying to offload to give you the right orthotic from the off. Okay? From there, I would always rather see someone give you an orthotic as a short-term solution to an ongoing problem than a long-term crutch. Okay, so as a rehab device, so let's say I've got a problem with tibialis posterior tendon, so up here. Okay, and poor old tib post, he really struggles when I'm perhaps not as good at controlling pronation as I should be. So if in trying to offload this tendon, while I'm strengthening and going through all my remedial exercises, if I'm given an orthotic device which just gives me a little bit of a hand in terms of controlling pronation, rear foot pronation, then that is going to take a little bit of stress off tib post, give it a little bit of a chance to heal, then we can wean you off that in time. That's how I'd much rather see it used, rather than, as I see all the time, I was given this in 92, and it's probably a bit past it now, but I do all my walking and all my running and, with these orthotics, which are probably well past it. You mean 1992? Yeah, definitely past it. That's probably an exaggeration. 2002 maybe. That long-term approach, I'd rather deal with what's happening intrinsically, and then give you something to help you win that battle, or get someone to give you something to help you win that battle. It's not my remit. And use orthotics that way. Does that help?
Yeah, so the fact you said control the pronation just gives the impression that you would rather do some exercise that would bring you the ability to
control yourself.
Control it.
Yeah, for sure.
If you have a dropped arch or something like that, which is, you can do exercise, you would give exercises around that to try and improve it.
Yeah.
I suppose the risk is once you start wearing the sole, you do become reliant upon it, don't you?
Yeah.
It feels that way.
Yeah, definitely. Either up here or actually reliant. Either way, it's irrelevant. It's a relevant conversation.
Did you? Graduate for smaller and smaller.
Yeah. Definitely. Anybody else?
Yeah. You sort of have got all your strength and conditioning exercises after
I see. Yeah.
sessions. What about somebody who does manual physical work?
Okay.
Is there any reason in your mind why at the end of the day they can't just go straight into that if they're warmed up?
Yeah, absolutely. If you are, it comes back to what we were saying earlier on. As long as you're not just getting out from behind the desk or getting out from behind the wheel or what have you and going into it cold, more than happy. More than happy. Putting it post-run here could be split. I could say, do this pre and post, and do that post. Yeah, there are various different ways we could go with it. The one sort of baseline caveat is just don't do it cold. That's pretty much kind of the long and short of it, really. Does that help? Yeah.
No,
Cool.
Just wondered whether you because you all yours are post run, post exercise, or
Yeah.
why perhaps you can't sort of you get home, you've got a spare quarter of an hour before you have to rush off and do something else that you
Absolutely.
do it there and then.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's getting it done, but just not getting it done cold. I think that's the best way of thinking about it. So I want to wrap things up, and essentially, as I said right at the front, there is a reason we're all here this evening to talk about this. Bulletproof Runners Program essentially is it's a week by week program. It's actually a monthly subscription, but it's a week by week program that gets delivered on the Monday, so that you have for the week in hand, a set of exercises that you work through during the week. Now, naturally, on the understanding that we're all different and the appreciation that we're all different, sending out a set of generic exercises, it's going to give everyone a good baseline, but we all do have different needs. So the one thing that does really well alongside the program that gets sent out is the interaction of the Facebook private members group that goes alongside the Bulletproof Runners program. So when the program comes out, if there's, for example, a lunge, okay, so a set of forward and back lunges in the program, but you're currently nursing a knee issue, that's where I got people hopping onto the members-only Facebook group and saying, hey James, lunges right now aren't really working out so well for me because of the knee issue that I had coming into the program. Can you substitute it for something else? And that's where, we've probably all, those of us on Facebook, seen groups where you're in the group but it's kind of tumbleweeds. It's really nice to see the back and forth within the group and the engagement within the group where people are kind of helping each other out. I'm there all the time helping people out, giving them different variations for different exercises. But the whole premise for Bulletproof Runners and the workouts across the week is to give you essentially the guidance from week in, week out, but also the accountability from week in, week out, so that you know specifically what you're meant to be doing, exercise-wise. We have an accountability call on the Sunday where people upload their progress sheets. There's a progress sheet you can either print out or fill in online. And you can literally be held to account throughout that to make sure that you're getting the work done. And the big things that I see amongst runners when we talk about strength and conditioning work, it's kind of twofold. Firstly, one of the big barriers to people getting the strength and conditioning work done is time. And again, compared to finding multiple hours in the gym across the week, I find that the little and often approach works really well, but also direction. I find, and this is the big one, that runners so often know that they should be doing this kind of work, but it's what specifically they should be doing in this myriad of different options they have. You can hop onto YouTube and type in, leg strengthening exercises. All of a sudden, you've got so many different options. A lot of the time, I find runners choose nothing. Okay, in this position of overwhelm, there's like, right, I don't know what to do. Okay, it seems silly, but it's the conversations I've had again and again. So this is basically taking that guesswork out and saying that these are the exercises, 3 key exercises this week, it'll be 3 exercises next week, blah, 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 blah. And over the course of a number of weeks, what we do is we vary the exercises up so you hit all the important key areas. From an experience point of view, knowing what we all need to be working on, we can start to tailor the exercise, the generic side of the exercises so that across the weeks we're hitting all those areas, but also from an individualistic point of view, you can hop on the Facebook group. Those not on Facebook, I'm available via email as well, and we can just swap exercises in, swap exercises out. And as well, remember the SIN acronym we were talking about earlier. People hop onto the group and like, you know what, I went for a run and my hamstring feels a little bit tight. Again, we can say, right, before that becomes something, let me just ask you a couple of questions and then give you a quick exercise, see if this helps. Okay, it's never and instead of going to see the physio, if you need to see the physio, sometimes the answer is you need to see the physio. But it's certainly something that since March I've seen really good uptake with. The monthly price is $15.99 per month. But what I'm doing with these seminars and the online seminar as well that we've recorded this evening is actually giving you guys an ongoing half price deal. Okay, so it's constantly $7.99 per month, not just for the first month, but for the duration of the subscription. So there's no minimum buy-in. You can literally come in for a month, see if it's for you. If it's not, come out. There's no issue with that. And it's ongoing. There's no end date. Okay, so it's something which is put together to see people through their running journey, if that's not too corny. Anyway, I'll leave that with you. It's in the PDF document. There's the link for more information about the program there. On there is a link where people would normally go if they found the program online to pay full rate. Once you're on there, don't click that link. Click that link if you're interested, because that gives you the half price deal. Okay, so as I said, leave that for you to mull over. But thank you guys for this evening. Hope you found it helpful. And I know we've been through a Q&A, but always grab me now or send me an email if you've got any questions. Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you.